What's poppin', everybody? This is the cartoon kid Ray Rollins, and today I am talking about SpongeBob SquarePants Season 12, Episode 6, Part 1, called Swamp Mates. It's been a while since I talked about SpongeBob here on the channel, man, but I'm a big time SpongeBob fan, and you know, that's the number one thing we're going to be talking about here on this channel. We're always going to have some SpongeBob reviews on this bad boy. But as always, before we get into breaking this episode down, I'm gonna have to give y'all that episode breakdown. So this episode basically is about SpongeBob telling a story, or a bedtime story rather, to Gary. And this bedtime story basically centers around Patrick Star and Bubble Bass being playdates, or play pals, playdate pals, basically friends on a playdate, okay? Now this all comes about when Bubble Bass is in his mother's basement like DJ Academics, playing with his little action figures, right? So his mom basically breaks him out of his whole little trance, brings him back to reality, and she's like, yo, Bubble Bass, man, go outside and make some friends. Bubble Bass, being like every millennial today, well, I can't say that, I'm kind of in that group, he's like, the sun gives me gas, you know I can't go outside like that. And she's like, okay, you know what, fine. I found you a friend and you guys are going to have a play date. And he's like, come on, Mom, I'm not 23. And she's like, too bad, your friend's already here now. So Bubble Bass basically goes up the stairs, let him in. And it turns out to be our favorite pink starfish homie, Mr. Patrick Star. Bubble Bass is over here trying to look for his Wonder Whale action figure, and he doesn't want to be bothered with Patrick. So Patrick's over here trying to come up with ideas of games they can play, and he suggests they play Swamp. So he pulls this big old bag out of his pockets like Courage the Cowardly Dog, right? And then he starts dumping this swamp liquid, swamp water, whatever you want to call it, all over the basement. Long story short, the basement ends up getting flooded with that green swamp liquid, and Bubble Bass sees his Wonder Whale action figure. So what ends up happening next is Bubble Bass tries to grab the action figure. Patrick tries to fix the solution by flushing the toilet, which causes everything to go into like a whirlpool motion, and they ended up being sucked underwater. And we transition to a swamp, which we later find out is a hallucination or a dream or whatever that Bubble Bass has while drowning. But in this hallucination / dream, it basically focuses around Bubble Bass and Patrick trying to get Wonder Whale back from this person called the Voodoo Villain. So that's pretty much it, man. Obviously they end up getting them and whatnot, and everything at the end of the day is all hunky-dory and happy. But let's start talking about the episode. My first initial thought for this episode is that for it to be a superhero-centered episode, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know I'm kind of breaking off into review territory here, but listen, man, I never really cared for the whole Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes. Don't get me wrong, some of them were good, like the whole episode where SpongeBob gets Mermaid Man's belt, and when they try to rehabilitate Man Ray in a different episode. They have a good bunch of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes. But me personally, I'm never a huge fan of these superhero style episodes. But this one really, honestly, was enjoyable to me. Another thing that I really like about this episode is that it centers around Bubble Bass. Now, call me crazy, but that's another good quality of this episode. During the classic time of SpongeBob, you know, seasons 1, 2, and 3, you know, the golden era, if you will, we don't get to learn much about Bubble Bass. We don't learn anything really about Bubble Bass. He's pretty much a mystery. He's just known as the guy who was hiding the pickles under his tongue, trying to convince SpongeBob that he made bad Krabby Patties. And I'm not going to sit here and act like I've been watching every single SpongeBob episodes coming out on Nickelodeon, but even then, it's just like I was never aware that Bubble Bass was a huge nerd, you know. We see a little glimpse of it in Squid and Aware, I believe it was, where we see him at this whole little nerd gathering or comic book meeting or whatever. And that's the first time I actually got a glimpse of Bubble Bass being the nerd. And is there any other episodes beforehand where his whole love for comic books is pretty much brought up in previous seasons? Probably. I personally haven't seen it. But this is the first time where we get a big glimpse of who Bubble Bass really is as a character. And that's a nerd, which, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. I love my anime I love my manga. Well, I don't read manga, but I'm a big fan of anime. So, and Mortal Kombat. So if that makes me nerdy, cool. But either way, we get to learn about Bubble Bass, which is a huge plus for this episode. But let's get on into moments, and we're going to touch back more on that in the review portion of this video, which will be later on. So this episode, obviously, with Patrick being the main, I guess you could say main co-host, main co-star, I guess you could say, of this episode, you already know it's going to be 100% comedy filled. And there's going to be a lot of jokes centered around Patrick being the idiot. And I'm going to mention it very quickly. Modern day Patrick or classic Patrick? I think this Patrick in this episode feels like classic Patrick. I know me and my buddy Alex usually get into the whole Patrick debate in every single episode that he's a star in. So I'm not going to really touch on that in this video. But this feels like classic Patrick to me because he has some brains in this episode, while he was still being the same idiot that he was in seasons 1, 2, and 3 of SpongeBob. I personally like the whole aspect of basically Patrick befriending Bubble Bass, and even in vice versa. You can see at the beginning of this episode that Bubble Bass is not trying to, hang with Patrick. He doesn't care about Patrick. He just wants to find his Wonder Whale action figure. Patrick's whole goal in this episode is to befriend Bubble Bass and hang out with him and play some games with him. So that's how this whole swamp stuff got started. Some of the main comedic moments in this episode obviously center around Patrick. The first one that really gives me the chuckles is when Bubble Bass ends up swallowing some swamp debris after Patrick sneezes it in his face. And he's like, oh, my tongue, man, I need to get some water or something. So Patrick gives him a glass, right? He ends up guzzling it down and he spits it out. He's like, ugh, where'd you get this disgusting liquid from? Patrick just scoops up the swamp water juice or whatever and just plops it in his mouth. You see something just plop in his mouth. Obviously, it's swamp slime. And the first thing I thought was like, damn, man. People were saying that the whole episode of SpongeBob getting the splinter was bad. And I was like, nah. This episode, in my opinion, just definitely takes the cake. Just look at how that swamp water just plops in his mouth, man. Come on, man. So obviously, with them being in the swamp, there's going to be a lot of gross factor here in this episode. Or maybe you could just say that one moment. But that moment honestly got me. Second moment of this episode that I found kind of funny, or I'd say cool rather, was when they come across the shack of, I don't want to say hillbillies or rednecks. That sounds bad. Oh, shit. What do I say? Fuck it. We'll just say cartoon moonshiners, but instead they're using hot sauce. So they're hot saucers, okay? I'm still just going to leave that comment in there for a nice, funny little blooper. But anyway, they come across these group of hot sauce bootleggers, and they say, yo, our hot sauce is illegal because it's so hot that you can blow your head clean off with it. So Patrick over here, being Patrick, ends up chugging the whole thing of hot sauce. His head ends up coming off and destroying their hot sauce still, and now they're running from these folks. But by doing that, Patrick just gained some superpowers, man. He's able to breathe fire like a dragon. So that's what their hot sauce does for Patrick, which ends up giving him a nice, useful ability during this episode. And to top it all off, man, one final moment that I do like, and I have to mention it, man, was when Patrick and Bubble Bass finally become friends. So they end up getting the Wonder Whale from the voodoo villain, and the hot sauce people end up catching up with them. So their whole thing is they gotta outrun these guys, right? So Bubble Bass is like, man, I wish I had something big and buoyant to float on so we can get a leg up on these guys. Patrick's like, I don't know what big and buoyant means, but he jumps in the whole little swamp lake thingy. He's like, hop on, friend. And Bubble Bass is like, friend? The whole cartoon mushy happy goodness of when a nerd befriends another person. Patrick's like, yeah, you're my play date. You're my buddy. And he's like, buddy? And Bubble Bass obviously hops on, and they end up getting up out that jam until they end up falling in like an endless waterfall, I guess if you want to call it that. And we transition to Patrick giving Bubble Bass CPR and whatnot. We're brought back into reality. And that's where the episode pretty much ends. Bubble Bass does end up finding his Wonder Whale at the end of the day, which is the good thing for this episode. But his mom's basement is flooded, and he's got to deal with that. So, my final review, man, like I said, This episode is a Bubble Bass centered episode, which is a character who I didn't know much about. Maybe it was touched on a little bit more in previous seasons where I didn't see the episodes because, SpongeBob had its bad period. But even with that being said, I saw a darn good portion of those episodes, probably up to maybe season 8 or 9. So I missed a handful of episodes that I don't know if he was covered on or touched on character-wise. But this is my first time actually seeing him really have his own episode, doing his own thing. I also got to mention too, with me being a heavy Patrick fan, I got a little bias towards this episode, man. It's a Patrick-centered episode too. I love Patrick. Patrick's the pink homie, and I'm happy to see him in this episode too. So obviously that's going to play a little bias in my rating. But long story short, this was a superhero-styled episode. It wasn't the traditional SpongeBob episode, if you ask me. A traditional SpongeBob episode focuses primarily around, obviously, SpongeBob, since he's the protagonist of the series, either being in Bikini Bottom, facing some weird challenge or whatever. Maybe he's at the Krusty Krab, maybe he's with one of his friends. But typical SpongeBob episodes don't have this superhero-style theme. This episode fell into the superhero-style theme, if you ask me. And like I said, I'm not a huge fan of it. But they made this episode enjoyable. Like I said earlier, this was a comedy-heavy episode, which definitely played a huge part into the enjoyability of it. Me personally, I just felt like everything just clashed perfectly in this episode. Because you got Patrick, who serves as, obviously, the main comedy centerpiece of the episode. We see that Bubble Bass doesn't get along with anyone, so he's not trying to mess with Patrick. But the key thing here is that Bubble Bass, for not being a main character, they have Patrick here to kind of help out with that, to give longtime fans of SpongeBob someone who they want to see. We want to see Patrick help. We don't care much about Bubble Bass, but we want to see Patrick. We fucks with Patrick. It's just like if you're doing a show or a podcast with somebody and you have the more popular person on. Obviously, they're going to tune in to see the more popular person. We want to see Patrick. This was Bubble Bass's episode, but Patrick was there to basically serve as the co-star in a sense, to basically get people intrigued, which he did a damn good job of. Like I said, this episode just feels like the right mixing of characters, the right mixing and pacing of plot, and a fairly interesting ending, man. So, to put it simple, my rating for this episode, I'm going to have to hit it with an 8 out of 10. I am, man. Because like I said, this is not an episode that would probably interest me on a normal day. Simply because it's not my style of episode, and because I was really intrigued. I really enjoyed the story. Obviously, like I said, I got a tad bit bias because, it's Patrick, man. I love Patrick. I've been very vocal about that in all of my SpongeBob videos. But the thing that really gets me here is that this episode focuses on a character who I couldn't give two shits about, man. I don't care about Bubble Bass and his bubble ass. I don't care about him, man. But it was just, like I said, the perfect mixing of characters, plot, comedy. It just felt like a darn good mix. It wasn't an episode that I'm normally interested in, but I loved it. I enjoyed this episode. So I'm going to have to hit this with a rare 8 out of 10, man. For this being a modern day SpongeBob episode, this really felt like a good episode to me. And I'm not trying to say that to down all the modern SpongeBob Day episodes, but all OG SpongeBob fans can agree that the newer seasons haven't been hitting like that. And when you come across a good episode, man, you gotta give it the love it deserves. And to me personally, I think this is a good episode. But that has been my review for SpongeBob SquarePants Season 12, Episode 6, Part 1, Swamp Mates, man. If you have an opposing opinion of this episode, man, toss it down in the comments box below, because I really like to hear what people think about this episode. Tell me if you like it. Tell me if you hate it. Tell me what you would rate it. And until then, this has been the Cartoon Kid Ray Rollins on the Cartoon Kid channel, where we talk cartoons every Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, baby. And until next time, I will see y'all when I see y'all. Peace out, everybody.